Joined by knitwear designer Victoria Marchant.
Oh, hello.
Victoria, would you like to introduce yourself, tell us your pronouns, and share with us what you do?
I'd love to. There we go, there's an My pronouns are she and her. I'm a knit and sometimes crochet designer. I've been doing that for just over a year now. And before that, I worked on software that's used by investment bankers to trade on the stock market.
Now, I'm an ex-software designer myself.
Hello, fellow nerd.
No, I'm not a knitter, but I seem to know more and more people who are. How do you feel about knitting and other yarn crafts becoming something of a phenomenon in this strange new world?
I think it's pretty wonderful, to be honest. I mean, I think there's still that stereotype of knitting and crafting being something that maybe nans and mums do without very much skill for a little bit of fun on the side of all their caring and parenting duties. So anything that disrupts that devaluation of creative labour is a great thing in my book. You know, creative skill is still a skill. And any of those knitters will tell you that it's actually pretty technical, especially if you're designing garments or creating brand new stitch patterns. And that's what I really love about it. There's the freedom and the creative side of it, but also there's plenty of reasons to bust out a spreadsheet.
That sounds great to me. I'm not great with hand-eye coordination, so I really struggled with knitting. But I like the idea of combining creative arts and industry. I mean, it's not just for old ladies. When did you decide to make knitwear design your job?
That was February 24th, 2020.
That's a very exact date.
Let me tell you the story of how it all came about. So my daughter and I are both autistic, and when she was about to start school, it became pretty clear that me having a normal 9 to 5 job just wasn't going to work out. It put all this pressure on our morning routine, and we couldn't find any suitable after school care. And the bottom line was that the simplest solution was for me to quit work and be there for her. So that's what I did. After a little while, we sort of settled into a nice routine, and I found that I really missed having a job, but I couldn't commit to meeting anyone else's schedule and demands. So I was spending a lot of my time during the day knitting anyway, and I was starting to have all these design ideas, and it just seemed like a really natural thing to try releasing them and see what happens. I'm extraordinarily lucky in that I don't need to worry about bringing in an income. So it started out by just being about meeting my needs to feel like an individual rather than, mum, wife, and to give my brain something to do that was a bit more complex than an Ocado shop. Then last February, I went to Countess Ablaze's workshop, Rock Out With Your Yarn Out, which is all about helping small yarny businesses find their voices and identities and come up with marketing strategies.
I was there as well.
Were you? You were there? Oh, well, that's why this has happened, isn't it? This is stars, planets aligning.
Such a great day.
Well, it was. And it was February 24th, 2020.
That was the last yarn show I went to.
Wow. I didn't go to the show because, the pandemic and everything made me think it was a bit nervous, and I have a really big stash, so I really didn't need to buy any more yarn. So no, I'll be good. But I'll go to the workshop because that's business. That's different. So I was there, and I kind of felt like an imposter all day because I hadn't actually started a business yet. And, I was surrounded by all these people who were there doing it. And I was sort of sitting there thinking like, well, I'm not doing it yet. I don't know what my USP is. I don't know. I haven't got a clue. But the point of it for me was to ask those questions and to sort of start on the right foot. And maybe if I didn't have answers right away, I knew what to be thinking about. And that's exactly what happened. I walked out in the heaving rain, got in the car, whipped over to the school to pick up my daughter. And by the time I got to the school, the cogs were turning, the questions were starting. I had a list of spreadsheets to start. That was it. Decision made.
Oh, Countess Ablaze has a great online community. The Underground, I love lurking in there.
So am I until I've got a pattern coming out.
I really want to ask you about Ravelry. Last year, obviously, they changed a lot. The whole site was redesigned. And that redesign, how did it impact your business in those early days?
Well, the timing was a nightmare because I'd started by making plans to sell my patterns through Ravelry because that was what you did in February 2020. And I had this whole schedule and a spreadsheet, naturally, hoping to launch the first one in July. And then June comes along. And I was, one day just logging into Ravelry and I thought, oh my God, the style sheet hasn't loaded. What's happened? And then I realized that this was an intentional change. My gut reaction was, oh my God, I hate it. But on the encouragement of another designer, I tried to give it a chance, and I spent a lot of time, poking around, having a look, trying to find things I liked about it, because I'm one of these people who can be a bit resistant to change. And then that evening, I ended up having the one and only migraine I've ever had in my life. I had to sit on the sofa very still with the lights off, or else I felt really sick and dizzy. Like, I didn't have a headache, not like a traditional migraine. I just felt like everything was spinning and I was going to throw up. It was really bizarre. And at the time, I had no idea what was going on, really. And then my husband, who has migraines, said, that sounds like a migraine. And I said, well, why? No, thank you. And then, everyone else's reports started coming in saying that they were having migraines. And of course, Countess Blaze mentioned that she'd had a seizure, and Ravelry reacted the way they did. And, by the time June was over, it was pretty clear that selling there wasn't going to be an option. I was pretty lucky because I've built websites and web shops before. I've done that for work. So I had some experience to fall back on and knock up a quick website, as you do. But there were so many designers who were really kind of adrift and unsure what to do. There was loads of advice floating around from different people, some with better foresight than others. And it was really difficult to know what the right thing to do was and how to balance the needs of all these individual designers who were suddenly just sort of upended over the needs of the community as a whole.
Ravelry's response to people reporting effects, obviously some much worse than others, has been so disappointing. I don't really want to put any more money into Ravelry's hands. I've only been going on the site when I feel I absolutely have to, even though I haven't really suffered any side effects like migraines or anything, but I want to support those people who have been affected and effectively ignored. And I also want to support designers, but not Ravelry. Have you got any advice for people like me who maybe want to support you, but not Ravelry?
Yeah, definitely. So Ravelry's primary income stream isn't actually from pattern sales. It's from the advertising that they do on the site. So the very best thing that we can do to not support Ravelry is just to not use it. Don't log in, don't look up patterns there, don't use the forums, and don't buy there. Don't give them the traffic. That's what the Ravelry Green Out was all about, where Ravelry users agreed to log out and not log in again for a few days. And that worked. There was a really noticeable dip in traffic while that happened. And I do realise that leaves a pretty big hole in the yarn community, but, alternatives are popping up all over the place. Designers are shifting their social spaces to other platforms, like Countess Blaze, who we mentioned. She's on Mighty Networks now, and she's foregoing social media entirely, which I wish. And of course, many of us are making our patterns available elsewhere. And actually, I think that's a really good thing. Some people kind of think that accessibility is a box to check. You have a disabled loo and you put a ramp in and you're done. But actually, it's far more complicated than that. And one of the really difficult truths about accessibility is that different people need different things. And what might be accessible to one person or one group of people might be inaccessible to others. So from that perspective, having a variety of platforms, both for the community and for pattern discovery and purchasing, is a good thing. It also means that no one platform has a stranglehold on the community, and we won't end up reliant on any one person or small group to safeguard the community interests. It does make it harder to find new people, though, if there isn't that one-stop shop for discovery like Ravelry was. So the best thing to do is when you do find the designers who speak to you, make sure that you're on their newsletters and you're following them on social media so that they can tell you what they're up to. There are a few great ways to find them in the first place. There's the OffRav and OffRav designers hashtags on Instagram and Twitter. There's yarndatabase.com, which is a directory of designers and tech editors where you can filter by the kinds of patterns they have and also the designer's identity. There's great roundup newsletters like Fiber Happenings, and there's platforms like YarnPond who facilitate test knits, which lets you see what's coming up from lots of different designers and find new ones, even if you don't actually do any of the tests.
Oh, that's a great tip. I knew about YarnPond for test knitting, but I wouldn't have thought of it as a way to keep my ear to the ground for sort of what's coming up for my favourite designers. Yeah, that's a great tip. I did my first test knit about a year ago, and that was a lot of fun. So yeah, I might have a look on there again.
And you might end up doing a test knit anyway, who knows? Maybe one of mine, you could help me out.
Now, I may not be in the knitting community, but this situation hasn't passed me by. More recently, I understand a developer at Ravelry posted a manifesto on the site suggesting that NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, could be part of Ravelry's future. Catherine and I had been joking about this as a possible skip for our Would You Fund It part of the show, so we were surprised to see someone actually thinking about it seriously.
Totally. And you wrote a great blog post on the topic in an effort to explain the technical side of it to the knitting community. And thank you so much for doing that. I think I almost understood. I was able to have a conversation with my partner and be like, oh, actually, it's even worse than that. So can you tell us a bit about that and why it was so necessary to put that information out there?
Yeah, well, I think the simple answer there is that most people don't know what NFTs and blockchain are. And the manifesto in question didn't do anything to explain it. So someone had to, so we could make sense of this proposal and work out what we all think about it. One of the most common responses I see when NFTs are criticised is to claim that the person criticising it doesn't understand them. You know, you'd agree with me if only you knew more. So by explaining it in a less technical way, I was hoping to empower more people to have an informed opinion. I need to do a little tiny disclaimer here and say that I'm by no means an expert in NFTs. I've never worked with them. I've never studied them in any official capacity. I just read up about them because that's what nerds do when new technology comes out. We go Googling. And it's the kind of thing where if you understand the technology behind blockchain and why it works, your first thought might be, oh, actually, this is pretty nifty. It's an elegant solution to a problem. I like it. But what's elegant in theory isn't always good in practice, and NFTs specifically solve a problem that just doesn't exist. So I'm going to explain NFTs and blockchain even shorter and less technical than the blog post, hopefully. That's my goal. Stop me if I don't make sense. Okay, so blockchain is a technology that stores data in a specific way and makes it very difficult to hack or corrupt. NFTs are a type of data that's stored in a blockchain. Cryptocurrency comes into it too, because details of who owns which specific bits of cryptocurrency, sort of like which specific banknote, are also stored in a blockchain. And cryptocurrency is what people get paid in if they use their computing power to solve the complex equations in order to create and verify new blocks in the chain. This computing power is the really big problem with blockchain technology. Basically, creating a new block uses a whole load of computing power, which means electricity, which means, for some of it at least, fossil fuels, which we all know are terrible. Worse, lots of people who are known as miners, they will all try and solve these equations first in order to earn the cryptocurrency. So everyone who tries and fails has just wasted huge amounts of resources. The whole practice is incredibly wasteful. And I really don't think that cost is worth it when you consider what NFTs actually are. They're essentially just a receipt for a digital thing. It might be a cat GIF. I mean, really, it might be a cat GIF. Or it might be high-end digital art. Or it might be a knitting pattern. They don't stop you or anyone else from copying that thing, so it's not copy protection. In theory, it's a higher quality receipt because it's so difficult to hack or corrupt the data that's stored in a blockchain. But I don't think that's the kind of security we need for knitting patterns. And it gets worse. NFTs are inherently linked to cryptocurrency, specifically one called Ether, that's traded on the Ethereum blockchain, which means that if you want to buy an NFT, you have to pay in Ether, which means transferring your money into Ether, which is another block in another chain and more fossil fuels wasted. Then you also have to pay the transaction fee for doing that, which will obviously jack up the price of patterns because designers can't pay that. You have to pay the price of the NFT itself, and you also have to pay for something called the gas, which is where the buyer, which is the person buying the knitting pattern and the NFT that goes with it, they have to pay the miners for all of that environmentally devastating work that they're doing. And here's the kicker, that's not a flat fee. It's a variable market rate, which means if there's a lot of demand right now, because, say, Stephen West just put out a new pattern and everybody's buying it, then the price goes up. If you can't afford to outbid everybody else, your transaction goes to the end of the queue and you have to wait. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, maybe days. In theory, any amount of time could pass before your transaction gets picked up by the miners and you get your NFT and therefore your pattern. So what's being suggested here is that every time a knitter buys a pattern, they also buy an NFT to prove that they've bought it. At least I think that's what's being suggested. Then when the knitter wants to open the pattern, whether that's via Ravelry's library or an app or a different website, the NFT would be checked to make sure that they're allowed to do that, which does sound kind of nifty that you can buy it anywhere and open it anywhere, but it's easily worked around by like opening the PDF in Preview or Acrobat or printing it and taking it to the pub. So not only do NFTs currently have a terrible environmental impact in their own right, they're also contributing to the environmental impact of cryptocurrency. They do very little to improve the knitter's pattern buying experience, and they might actually insert a huge delay between you buying a pattern, which now costs more, and actually getting it, which might really mess up that cast-on party.
That would totally derail a knit along.
Wow, I'm learning so many different new words. Knit along, cast on party, incredible.
Yeah, or a cal for a knit along or a crochet along.
So let's get back to a brighter note. Can you tell us about any designs that you're working on at the moment?
Oh, yes, please. So July is my first birthday as a designer. My first pattern came out July last year. So I'm doing a double pattern release instead of just the one to celebrate. The two patterns are called Zenith and Nadir, and they're both shawls, but they're opposites of each other. The inspiration came really from emotions and feelings and mental states. So Zenith is all about that effortless, carefree feeling where the sun is shining and crypto hasn't decimated the planet. Everything's going right and there's nothing to worry about. And Nadir is the opposite. It's that feeling that everything's going wrong, everything's too hard, and you feel like you can't make a decision because you'll just get it wrong and make things worse. Which I know sounds like a terrible inspiration for a knitting pattern, but bear with me. So they both use the same yarn, and for Nadir, it's held double on bigger needles, so it works up nice and quickly. And I went with really familiar, comforting stitch patterns, things like ribbing and garter stitch, switching between the two and increasing to make a scalene triangle. So it's asymmetrical, it's a bit pointy and offset to sort of echo that bad mood, but it's a pretty mindless knit. There's no cast on, you just start with a slip knot, and then the finished shawl is really squishy and comforting because of holding it double. So it's sort of like a hug that looks like it's angry. Well, that's kind of the idea. It's not supposed to remind you of that bad mood. It's supposed to help you through it. So there's sort of nods to it in the visual design of the spiky, asymmetric, offset things. But at the end of the day, it's there to make you feel better. It's there to sort of pull you out of that pit, nudge you back towards the light, as it were. And then Zenith is the opposite of that. So it's a half pie shawl. The yarn is held single, and it has slipped cable stitches with beads to make a stitch pattern that most people probably won't have used before, because I actually invented it. It looks a little bit like little X's with a bead in the middle, so it's like a little beaded kiss. It's all very small and fiddly and lots of tiny stitches, and you have to pre-string your beads, and it's a little bit more effort. And of course, the finished shawl is much lighter and drapier because the yarn's not held double. So they're really kind of, they're opposites. It's the deep pit of despair and then the bright shining light. And they are both knit in exactly the same yarn, just in different colours. One, Nadir is sort of a deep dark teal, and then Zenith is a bright, shining, soft duck egg. So they're really very opposites, but they do kind of photograph nicely together as well. Both of those are in tests at the moment on Yarn Pond, and they'll be out on July the 16th. If you can't wait for those, I do have another one that's out next week on Friday the 18th of June. That one's called Kodachrome, and it's a really easy knit. It's, again, a bit of a contradiction, because it's a great thing to be knitting in the summer because it's small and light, because it's a hat. But it's really meant to be worn in the dead of winter because it's so cozy warm. It's a very simple knit. It's very straightforward. It's mostly just stockinette, but there's colour blocking in it because it's knit with two different yarns, the Soulmates yarns by Black Stag Yarn. They are the most gorgeous merino and a super silky soft Suri alpaca silk, and they're in two different colours. One's grey and one's red in my test knit. And the pattern sort of switches between the two. So sometimes you're using one, sometimes you're using the other, sometimes you're using both, sometimes you're holding things double. And it makes this sort of cozy, fluffy little head warmer. And it gives you absolutely loads of opportunity to play with colour, hence the name.
Do you have any words of wisdom for those inspired to put needle to wool for the first time after the show?
Yeah, definitely. Swatch, practice, and block. Remember that any skill takes practice to learn. There's more than one way to do pretty much everything, and Google is your friend. Also, if you want some patterns that are carefully designed and written with consistency and clarity, I know someone. In fact, I am someone.
For those people who might not know, because I didn't know when I started knitting, my gran taught me and she never swatched once in her life. What is swatching?
When you buy yarn, they might tell you on the ball band what size needles to use and how many stitches and how many rows you will get per 4 inches or 10 centimetres square of knitting. And that's kind of a good starting point. But the thing is, everybody knits differently. Not just sort of whether you're a thrower or whether you knit continental or whether you do the thing where you tuck the straight needle under your arm. There's so many different ways of doing it. Your tension, which is how tightly you make the stitches, will vary between people. I mean, it might vary just for you as well. I know if I'm in a really bad mood, I don't knit because my tension gets so tight, you're basically just stabbing yourself. We don't want to do that. If I wanted to do that, I'd take up needle felting. So one of the things we can do to make sure that things are going to be the size that the designer tells you they're going to be is to make sure that when you knit, you get the same gauge as the designer's pattern, or very close to. Sometimes it doesn't matter. With some shawls like Nadir, if you're off a bit, it's not going to matter. It'll be big enough. It might be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, but it's going to be in the right ballpark, and it's a shawl. If it's half an inch smaller, the world won't end. If you're knitting a jumper and it's half an inch smaller and it's meant to have negative ease, that might actually make it so small that it doesn't fit you the way you want it to. So if you want your knitting to be the same size as the designer has intended, then you need to do what's called a gauge swatch, which is really just a little square of knitting using the needles that you're hoping to use for the pattern.
Oh, I'm a very loose knitter. I once made a pair of gloves without swatching, and they just ended up like they were supposed to be for the Incredible Hulk. And if anyone who's met me would know, I've got tiny child hands. So, it can be quite dramatic, the difference between your knitting and the designer's knitting. So yeah, I can sometimes find myself going down a whole millimetre in needle size.
So, Victoria, where can our listeners find you, your blog, and your designs online?
You can find all of my patterns, my blog, links to my social media accounts, and subscribe to my newsletter and more, all at victoriamarchantknits.com.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been absolutely wonderful.